The last 2 days we have been discussing about diabetes, and it is a big topic, and it's impossible for a person to cover about the importance of this topic and the challenges also when we face managing these patients. So I will just putting some of the points that we have been discussing, we have learned from books, and I will gather from my own experience. But definitely we will have more at the end of the presentation. Okay. Today we'll be discussing this, the third section on the webinar series organized by NHM. And today we will be discovering more of the treatment guidelines, Kerala state protocol, monitoring of complications and care, and diabetes in special groups and diabetes care in hospitals. So most of the things are huge topics by itself. So we will be just seeing what we should be knowing or what we must know. And it's actually an effort to bring us back to the management of NCDs, because all over the globe, the entire state or country or the world as such was after COVID, and now we are slowly coming back to our routine patient care. And our patients are also really want us to see them properly, because they were also feeling that their control is not that proper when we were regularly seeing them from the clinics and advising them, because challenges are more in a diabetic patients, and challenges more to stick to the treatment, to the diet and lifestyle. So I am again emphasizing the cornerstone of diabetes management is diet, lifestyle modification, diabetes self-management, education, and the key person is the patient and then the family. So we need to continuously empower them and support them. So today we are going to discuss about the treatment guidelines. When we discuss about treatment guidelines, this slide is very, very important. This is more emphasized this time with the World Diabetes Day message by the International Diabetes Federation: access to healthy diet and physical activity, and access to diabetes care. If not now, when? That was the key message. And we know that we are very much blessed. We get drugs, we get treatment. Our patients are really getting insulin. There is not that many people suffering for non getting the treatment timely, but many of the parts of the world actually suffering to get insulin, access to oral medicine, access to set monitoring, access to education, psychological support, and access to healthy diet and physical activity. So there is a huge gap exists. And the guidelines, usually we get the standard treatment guidelines from American Diabetes Association every year, and Research Society of Study of India, International Diabetes Federation, World Health Organization, our state guidelines, or all states have their own guidelines. ICMR comes up with guidelines. So there are two, an association comes up with guidelines. So too many guidelines are there, but we need to know where we are practicing and what is the primary responsibility. And from the government point of view, being in a government setup, we always wanted more people to get must be accessible to treatment, and they come and get the treatment continuously, uninterrupted supply of medicines, and there is a regular monitoring. This is what we are aiming at, and we are also actually working for that. So this is the most important message in diabetes care. Access to diabetes care is very, very important, and we must ensure if we write some prescriptions and patient just vanishes away, it can be, we can be doubly sure that the most likely because the patient cannot afford the treatment that we have prescribed. So we should have possibilities how to ensure that the patient continues the treatment that we are prescribing. This is from the American Diabetes Association, the Diabetes Care 2020 I have taken just to emphasize comprehensive evaluation and assessment of comorbidities is the decision cycle for patient-centered glycemic targeting type 2 diabetes. So world over, what we emphasize that patient-centered care, that is more important in diabetes care, or it is the chronic care in any non-communicable disease, or where the patient continues to take the treatment. We need to ensure not only there will be adherence to whatever we advise to the patient. So this is the patient characteristic we need to assess. We need to consider specific factors that impact choice of treatment. It could be the patient diabetes control, it could be patient's weight, patient's risk of hypoglycemia, it could be the side effect profile profile of medication, or it could be the patient's capability to handle a complex regime. Suppose we give a basal bolus regime where the patient has to take 5 injections a day to an elderly person, it is unlikely that the person will be able to handle it. So where we go for pre-mixed 30-70 insulin morning and evening with a very easy way that the person can administer. So we need to consider those things, and patients likelihood of getting a survival life expectancy, all those things we will consider. And shared decision making to create a management plan, we need to tell the patient, we need to tell the family what is the purpose, how long they have to continue the medicine. And we all have experienced type 1 diabetes coming and asking, when can I stop my insulin? So they must be empowered to handle their disease. And then the doctor, the patient, the provider, and the all others in the team must agree upon the management plan. And we should tell them goals. We want them a control within 1 month, and the goals must be achievable. We should not give goals which is rather not achievable even for us, even if we dedicatedly practice it. And implement the management plan. And we need to go with monitoring and support, including review and agreeing on the management plan. So this is from a American Diabetes Association. We may not be doing the same way they are doing, because we are culturally and the accessibility things and many things are different. Insurance schemes are different. So we have to adopt it into our system so that we can manage it properly. And when we think of diabetes, I have already emphasized this cartoon. I have just put that we cannot discuss without discussing or emphasizing the need for diet and exercise. And this has to be told to the patient again and again. And this cartoon says, I can change a pumpkin into a carriage, but if you want to turn fat into muscle, you will have to exercise 2 hours a day. But we are telling them 30 minutes a day, and this we need to continue. So this is the importance of exercise. And when we discuss treatment guidelines, we should have a patient-centered approach. So patient should be able to understand why we are prescribing the treatment, why we are asking him to go for diet and exercise. And patient should be able to understand the treatment complexities. Patient should be able to handle the drugs that we are telling them, and patient should be able to monitor it. Patient should be able to compare if there are any complications. Patient should be able to understand hypoglycemia. So there are many things for this single word. We call it as patient-centered approach, and we need to give ample psychosocial support to stick to the regime. Otherwise, patient will go from one system to the other system and then to the other system. And we have seen even type 1 diabetes stopping the insulin and coming to us in a very advanced stage of ketoacidosis. So this is the most important message when we discuss about treatment. This is the 2018 EASG ADA guideline, and this is only discussing about glucose lowering medication in type 2 diabetes overall approach. And here they have been talking about established atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease or chronic kidney disease. And there they have included GLP-1 receptor agonist and SGLT2 inhibitors. We have already discussed about these drugs to some extent yesterday. And you can see that without established atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease or chronic kidney disease that we commonly see in our patient group, they were included. We need to minimize hypoglycemia, but they have put all the drugs, and they have put specifically sulfonylurea, thiazolidinediones, especially putting it as cost is a major issue. But we know that there are enough evidences, there are enough studies, because sulfonylurea, glimepiride is usually the comparator arm in most of the trials with SGLT2 inhibitors, with gliptins, all those things. We have enough data to say that the newer sulfonylureas, especially glimepiride and glycoside, are safe. And this I have been emphasizing yesterday also. First line therapy is metformin, along with comprehensive lifestyle, including weight management and physical activity. Patients usually ask, once they do the diet and lifestyle modification, their blood glucose will come under control. And if my values are normal, whether I should continue metformin. So our answer is yes, we have to continue metformin, and we start with a lower dose, and the maximum dose of metformin is 1 gram per day. So this is the newer guideline. Okay. This was the earlier 2020, and this is the one that we see with 2021. This is almost same, and we need to understand that they have considered independently atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. They have included GLP-1 or SGLT2 inhibitors. This is the gliflozin, all the gliflozins, canagliflozin, empagliflozin, dapagliflozin. We have been talking about it yesterday. And in heart failure, particularly with heart failure and reduced ejection fraction, LV ejection fraction less than 45%, they have included SGLT2 inhibitors, which it has shown a proven benefit. In chronic kidney disease, diabetic kidney disease with albuminuria, SGLT2 inhibitors has come up here, or GLP-1 receptor agonist. So these are specialized groups where there is some suggestions from American Diabetes Association. But we can see if A1C above individualized target, proceed as below. We can start either with after metformin. This is all after metformin. Blue bar is saying about metformin, lifestyle including physical activity and first line therapy, metformin. We can start DPP4 inhibitor, GLP-1 receptor agonist, SGLT2 inhibitors, thiazolidinedione, that is pioglitazone, or compel need to minimize weight gain. They have put SGLT2 inhibitor or GLP-1 receptor agonist. But they can see in the same bar, they have put it as cost is a major issue, but more than cost, sulfonylurea, the new modern sulfonylurea has shown even the similar benefit as many of these drugs when the patient do not have other compelling indications like atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease or cardiac failure or chronic kidney disease. We can safely use sulfonylurea and thiazolidinediones, and we can combine them, that is metformin with sulfonylurea with the thiazolidinedione as the third drug. And if these three drugs are not effective, we can go for the insulin therapy. Sulfonylurea is always a concern in those people where we do not have a, or where they have a high risk for hypoglycemia. So now I am moving on to the state guidelines. This is the treatment protocol for type 2 diabetes mellitus. In fact, we have worked on this in 2017 and early 2018. This guideline was prepared, and we can just revise it because this is the state guideline. We have been following it, but we have forgotten the NCD clinics and things because of total dedication to COVID management. So I thought I'll just review it because this is something we practice. And it says that if we have a patient with diagnosed type 2 diabetes mellitus, we know that we screen every patient above 30 years. And if the patient has got a fasting more than 120, more than or equal to 126, post-meal OGTT 75 gram more than 200, HbA1c more than or equal to 6.5%, we need at least two values for diagnosing diabetes. But if the patient comes with unequivocal hyperglycemic symptoms with single value of blood glucose more than 200 milligram per deciliter, hyperglycemic symptoms means polyuria, polydipsia, weight loss, all those things, and maybe ketosis, we need to put the patient on treatment immediately. And we know that if there is a delay in initiating treatment, we can also start with combination therapy. That means the patient has come to us at a period where they have already crossed the period for metformin, and then coming with the real symptoms of hyperglycemia, insulin deficiency like weight loss, we can start a combination with sulfonylurea and metformin as well. So we can see that we need to, if the patient has not diagnosed diabetes with symptoms and fasting plasma glucose more than 250, this patient we can start with metformin plus glimepiride on day one itself. They don't have to go for this algorithm with metformin 500, metformin 1000 like that. But whenever we initiate a patient on glimepiride, we must be very clear about it that hypoglycemia is a risk with metformin because there is insulin secretion. There need not be glucose, or even without food intake. If the patient takes metformin, glimepiride, there is insulin secretion. So patient can develop hypoglycemia if food is not taken at the timely interval, that is half hour before food they have to take, but they should not omit food if they take sulfonylurea. So we should train them on hypoglycemia Along with that, we should tell them what are the symptoms of hypoglycemia, as well as what are the symptoms of hyperglycemia, that is high blood glucose, and we should tell them what are the complications if they don't treat timely and sufficiently early. The complications are directly proportional to the duration of diabetes, as well as hyperglycemia or the uncontrolled glucose, the glycemic burden that the person is having. So we will start the patient if the patient has got a diagnosed diabetes but with mild symptoms or asymptomatic. We advise them with metformin 500 milligram once daily or twice daily. Why we start lower dose? Because gastric symptoms are very minimal for metformin, and if we start with lower dose and gradually up titrate, it has absolutely no symptoms. That is why we have initiated this diet. And once they are stable and we check after 1 month, and if the blood glucose are still high, we intensify the treatment to 1000 milligram BD and review them. And if the blood glucose are still not controlled, we start with glimepiride 1 milligram daily. But we have a patient with high sugar but risk of hypoglycemia, we don't know. We can start with a lower dose also, that is 0.5 milligram per day, depending on if there is a risk of hypoglycemia. And then we can gradually up titrate to 1 milligram twice daily. We know that we can add the third drug that we have included thioglitazone as the third, that 7.5 milligram daily. And if all the three drugs patient's blood glucose are still not uncontrolled, we can start the patient to start insulin. And if they start initiating insulin, that means we need to dedicate and we need to sit with the patient. We need to tell them why we are prescribing insulin, what is the reason, and how to take. There are really a lot of questions if you prescribe insulin, and usually patients thinks it is the last stage, that is why we have prescribed insulin. So this is the last time, or I have reached the end of the tunnel. That's something like that they ask. They don't have any hope further on their diabetes. So we need to tell them we need to initiate timely so that it is not the last resort. It is the timely intervention. So we have to tell them when to initiate, and the system is empowered, we can start insulin, or we can refer to the higher center if there is insulin is not available, or if we have adequate facility to train the people is not available. And we have put the laboratory values: fasting between 80 to 130 and post meal less than 180 milligram per cent deciliter, that have put the target value. This is for the common group, this is for everyone, and we make sure that everyone in our system gets the treatment for diabetes. That's the purpose for this algorithm. And we have the facilities to do the basic investigations also in our system. So this is the standard treatment protocol for type 2 diabetes mellitus from our state. So this is what I have already discussed. I have just elaborated so that we will see it again. So metformin, then glimepiride, and we don't have to worry that we are starting glimepiride when there are many other drugs, but glimepiride is still on the top where we can use, especially when cost is a concern. But we know that glimepiride, the newer drugs of sulfonylurea, do not have the problems related to the older drugs like ischemic preconditioning or the cardiac safety issues. All those things are not there for the newer drugs, and we have enough evidence also now to back up that the glimepiride is equally good. And we can see this is the sulfonylurea chart. This is also from Diabetes Association 2020. I have taken this chart, and we can see that the efficacy is high with sulfonylurea. Risk of hypoglycemia is high. Weight gain, usually there could be weight gain, but when we combine with metformin, it is safe. And we know that atherosclerotic cardiac failure and heart failure, they have put it as neutral. So there is no risk of cardiac failure or atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. We prescribe the newer sulfonylurea, that is second generation, third generation, especially glycoside and glimepiride. And there's an oral drug. Progression to diabetic kidney disease is neutral, and we that glyburide, that is the conventional dionyl or glibenclamide, is not recommended, but glipizide, glimepiride, glycoside, all these drugs are safe. And glipizide is a drug which has a very short half-life, and it's better in renal failure because it has a short half-life and it's predominantly excreted by liver. And FDA put a special warning on increased risk of cardiovascular mortality based on studies of older sulfonylurea. That is tolbutamide. It's not a drug at all for us. So we don't have to be worried, but why we are using sulfonylurea in our patient, but we are using the safe sulfonylurea and that is available. So we must be very confidently prescribing them, but educating the patient. But I have already mentioned there are some special situations like atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. There is high risk of hypoglycemia, progression of CKD, heart failure. We can use the newer drugs. So we need to individualize care, and the care should be patient centered. So I have been discussing about the current treatment guidelines and the state guidelines. And we have guidelines from International Diabetes Federation, RSSDA, and other associations, as well as guidelines are there from also from other associations also. We have guidelines by CMR. So we can look at everything, because I have not included, because this summary is almost the same in all these patients. And if the blood glucose is not controlled with oral drugs, this is for type 2 diabetes. We are speaking about type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, there is no question. It is insulin, insulin, insulin. Type 2 diabetes, if it is not getting controlled, we need to know when to initiate insulin. And if there is obvious weight loss or symptoms of hypoglycemia, we can start a patient on insulin after metformin. Okay. Now we are going on to the second part, that is microvascular screening of complications. So we need to screen for microvascular as well as macrovascular complications. I have put diabetic food separately because it includes the microvascular and macrovascular aspects. Peripheral artery disease also contribute to diabetic food. So we need to know when to monitor, how to monitor. So this is also part of our protocol. Kidney disease, what we do is we do the albumin, urine albumin, and actually the urine albumin creatinine ratio. It is normally less than 30 milligram per gram creatinine. That is normal. And in type 1 diabetes, we need to do is more than or equal to 5 years from onset. And type 2 diabetes, because there is an asymptomatic period that can happen in most of the patients. So we need to do it at diagnosis. Even with this much of facilities to screen diabetes, detect diabetes in government and private setup, we are still seeing people coming for the first time with blurring of vision, and the ophthalmologist is detecting diabetes. So this is the tragedy. So we need to be very careful. So we screen at diagnosis. So we know that macroalbuminuria, that is more than 300 milligram per gram creatinine, or an EGFR 30 to 60 ml per minute, this patient should be monitored twice annually. So we need to monitor once, but when there is a progressive proteinuria, we need to monitor more frequently. And we need to ensure blood glucose control, blood pressure control, control of weight, cessation of smoking, all those things we need to advise them. And who have normal blood pressure, normal urinary albumin creatinine ratio, that is less than 30 milligram per gram creatinine, there is no role for ACI or ARB, ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers, that is the losartan, telmisartan, and all those of sartans. So we need to record urine albumin creatinine ratio. We need to calculate estimated glomerular filtration rate using the formula of CKD-AP. This can be downloaded, or it is there in the QCalculate app that we have in our computer, laptop or mobile, and test renal function test. And if at all any of the things we feel it is not correct, it's going abnormal, or the center is not equipped, we need to refer the patient for better care. This is a role of risk of chronic kidney disease progression, and the frequency of visits also increases. So this is the glomerular filtration rate, and this is the albuminuria, less than 30 to 300, more than 300. Okay, so this is the way they should be monitoring, and as any of this drug, we have to refer them, and they need to have a more frequent, closer monitoring. Type 1 diabetes, same, more than 5 years. Type 2 diabetes at diagnosis, annual screening. If the ophthalmologist feel there is a more frequent intervention and screening needed, they will be attending more frequently. And we should do in pregnancy also at first diagnosis, second and third trimester, and postpartum. Usually it's better to have a screening for retinopathy. Retinogontography with remote reading by experts is also possible. Even if we are sitting in a primary health center with limited facilities, our government is also planning, or it is already come in some of the centers. So that will give us better idea and better screening facility. And the presence of retinopathy is not a contraindication to aspirin therapy if required. And we need to do timely referral. Neuropathy, same. Type 1 diabetes, more than 5 years. Type 2 diabetes at diagnosis, annual screening, and we need to look for pinprick temperature sensation. And large fiber, that is vibration perception with the 10-gram monofilament and vibration threshold. Protective sensation by 10-gram monofilament. Also think of diabetic peripheral neuropathy as well as autonomic neuropathy. And diabetic neuropathy is a diagnosis of exclusion, and we need to refer them if you suspect any abnormality, or if there is a failed detection of sensation, or there is a risk of high risk feet. We have to be very careful with the patient. What is this? I will just discuss this when we discuss the diabetic foot also. Okay, this is very important to see the protective sensation, and we need to know the vibration perception. We can use our tuning fork or the vibration perception threshold machines available. Okay, then we can beat the pinprick and temperature sensation for small fiber. Autonomic neuropathy, clinical manifestations of diabetic autonomic neuropathy is subtle. It could be hypoglycemia unawareness, it could be resting tachycardia, orthostatic hypotension, gastroparesis, constipation, diarrhea, fecal incontinence, erectile dysfunction, neurogenic bladder, pseudomotor, that is excessive sweating or decreased sweating. All these are features of autonomic neuropathy. But the most important and life-threatening may be cardiac autonomic neuropathy, because may remain asymptomatic, and mortality with resting tachycardia. They may be having resting tachycardia, that is heart rate more than 100 when they are taking rest. Orthostatic hypotension, that is a fall in blood pressure less than 20 systolic and less than 10 diastolic while standing from a lying down position without increasing in the appropriate increase in heart rate. This is very, very suggestive of autonomic neuropathy. And we can't do much for autonomic neuropathy, but these people are at risk of sudden death and things like that. So we should be telling them appropriately, advising them, and there are some modifications in drug and treatment we can make so that we can reduce the risk of developing this. Now we have seen about nephropathy, retinopathy, and neuropathy. Now we are discussing about foot care. The patient should have an annual comprehensive foot examination to identify high risk foot. And what we should have, or what we should be doing, is actually preventive foot self-care education. There should be a preventive diabetic foot clinic. We should be seeing the patient. We should be examining annually. We should be educating them so that the diabetic foot leading to amputation can be prevented. And we need to have a very thorough examination of the skin, foot deformities, neurological assessment, monofilament use, pinprick temperature, vibration, vascular assessment, including pulses in the legs and feet, and it is a multidisciplinary approach. Most likely, we will be having a field. I'm living alone. I don't have any recent technical technologies in my center. I may not be able to do this, but we should understand these are the risk factors for ulcers or amputation: poor glycemic control, peripheral neuropathy with loss of protective sensation, cigarette smoking, foot deformities, callus, corn, peripheral arterial disease, previous history of foot ulcers, amputation, visual impairment, chronic kidney disease. These are all risk factors for ulcers or amputation. A previous ulcer, previous history of amputation, all this lead to diabetic foot, or recurrence of ulcers, recurrence of extent of amputation. All these are there, and even if we are in a very limited facility, with small center, we can do a proper education of these patients. We can tell them what to do. We can ask them to see the foot every day, clean it, wipe it properly. There is no water in between toes. They should use proper footwear, and they should not walk without footwear. They should not wash their hands with their feet with hot water. Very common practice. Whatever it is, people think washing with hot water makes the foot safer, but actually they are burning without knowing that they don't know the temperature difference. They should use appropriate footwear, appropriate socks. They should not use they should not be doing self medications. They should do concap and things like that. They should do their own surgeries. They should be very careful in cutting their nails, all those things, and smoking. Very many things we can advise, and it should be a continuous thing so that we can prevent amputation to a larger extent. And if there is anything, and somebody at home, if there is a severe peripheral neuropathy, somebody at home, son, daughter, wife, husband, or a close relative or friend can examine the feet. And if there is anything smelling, burning, or any redness, anything, we have to ask them to see the doctor. So this is what we need for a diabetic foot examination. We need the knee hammer, we need the vibration for monofilament, and our tuning fork. We can do the peripheral pulses. This is the monofilament application, and if it just bends, and the person should be able to identify it. So this is what we need to do. This is all of us can do, and there is we should do between the toes. We should do the heel, see the pulses, all those things. It is very simple, and any MBBS doctor can do it, and we will be doing great for the patient if we identify them correctly. This is the way monofilament is used. It should just buckle, and patient should be able to identify that it is being touched. So this is the, and why I am so worried, because this is just to tell you what diabetic neuropathy for the patient. This is a true patient in our own diabetic, comes regularly to our diabetic clinic, but unexpectedly I have happened to see him in the casualty or the emergency department area, and he was walking like this. And I asked, I know him very familiar by his face, but I was never bothered to look at the feet. That's why I preserved this picture, because I was not doing it some years ago. And this patient, in fact, opened my eyes. Then I asked, why are you not wearing your footwear properly? He said, yes, doctor, I am wearing it properly. So this is how they feel. They are wearing it properly. So we need to see the feet. And it's some years ago, and maybe around 2005. And from that day, I understood that we are not seeing the patient properly. This is the thing. And we may boast that we are doing a diabetic clinic regularly. If I don't examine the feet, I'm not doing justice to the patient. Such simple fissure feet, all if we don't timely attend, this is a patient with the Charcot feet. So we have a lot many things to do, and this is about the patient which I have been talking about. And we are much blessed. This is not from our country, this is from somewhere else, because diabetic care is more difficult in other areas, but we have access to many of the things, so we should be doing for our patients. So routine foot examination is very important. Screening examination, neuropathy, vascular involvement of lower extremities, reduce morbidity from foot problems. So we have a lot many things before a patient develops ulcer, before a patient goes to the hospital for amputation. We are missing very many things. So we should be giving the same importance like retinopathy and nephropathy for diabetic foot as well. So I've been discussing about the protocols, guidelines, our state guidelines, which is from around 2018 we have been using. And I've already discussed about the importance of screening, about retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy, diabetic foot. But we must understand that macrovascular disease also can happen. Patient should come with angina or anginal equivalent. So we need to see that the patient's blood glucose is properly controlled, blood pressure is controlled, address the dyslipidemia, weight reduction, avoidance of smoking. So many things we can do for the patient. And if we suspect, there is no point in screening everyone for cardiovascular disease. But if a person comes with symptoms or anginal equivalent, definitely we should not forget, or we should not fail to direct them to the correct treatment facility. So now we are moving on to hyperglycemia in hospital. It's a very serious problem. We have seen it, we understood it in COVID times. Most of our ICUs, we were having very high sugars, and we were actually struggling to get the blood glucose under control. And it means a lot of time, lot of pressure on the system, and we need to train every staff in the system to get it done properly. And we can get patients, they could be diabetic, we know that they are having diabetes already, or they should be unrecognized diabetes with an HbA1c high, and now the blood glucose is 400 milligram per deciliter. or the HbA1c normal, but he is developing stress hyperglycemia, or it could be due to our drugs or the stress per se being in the ICU because of the infection. Many things can happen in a hospitalized patient. And in the hospital, it could be critically ill patient or not critically ill, or the patient can be in the ward, or the patient can be in the ICU, patient not able to eat anything, and we need to control the blood glucose. I know this is this, and most of the time, and no patient comes with diabetic ketoacidosis nowadays. Very rarely we get an admission for diabetes per se, but they come for something else like myocardial infarction, stroke, or infection, or pneumonia, or urinary tract infection, or whatever it is. So we need to be very careful, or it could be a routine assessment, evaluation. Patient detects to be blood, high sugars, and the patient is referred to us. So we must be very careful and must address it, not addressed until after the presenting medical problems have been treated. This is the usual situation, but now we have changed a lot. So what can we do for our patients admitted to hospital? We need to do blood glucose on all admissions. Steroid treated patients, we should be more careful. We need to diagnose diabetes, and we know the value. Fasting blood glucose more than or equal to 126, postprandial more than 200, and an HbA1c more than or equal to 6.5%, we can diagnose diabetes. And document diagnosis in the chart. Never forget to diagnose diabetes, and the discharge card should definitely carry that this patient being diagnosed diabetes in this admission. Hyperglycemia is diabetes until proven in a hospitalized patient. So it should be brought to all clinicians' attention. So it should be well documented in the case sheet and not on the problem list, phase sheet, so that nobody will forget when the patient develop abnormal behavior. It will not miss hypoglycemia. If possible, if facilities are available for a proper HbA1c, ask for an HbA1c so that we can detect diagnosis, undiagnosed diabetes. And in ICUs, I always ask to hold metformin, hold pioglitazone, especially in patients with congestive heart failure, hepatic failure, liver dysfunction, and none of us will be very comfortable with a drug that produce hypoglycemia like sulfonylurea or glimepiride or glipizide or all those stuffs. And all patients, which is better to start insulin, it is more easier for us to titrate. And these are the target values. More than 140 milligram per deciliter, think of diabetes. See more frequent values. Less than 70, think of hypoglycemia. Less than 54, severe hypoglycemia. Any patient, usually we aim for 140 to 180. But in a limited life expectancy, fluctuating sugars, risk of hypoglycemia, we go for something like 180 to 200 or around 200. And any HbA1c value more than or equal to 6.5%, diagnosed diabetes in the ICUs. And insulin requirement, suppose the patient on stable insulin 30 units and now coming to us with infection, there is a risk of infection causing increased dose of insulin, and there is a risk of decreased dose of insulin in patients with renal failure. We know that postpartum we need to reduce the dose. All those things we need to know. And when we control the infection, patient's insulin requirement reduces. When the patient start taking normal feed, stress has abolished, patient is recovering, the insulin requirement will decrease. And when we prescribe insulin, we need to think of basal insulin, bolus insulin. And at one point, if the blood glucose is very high, more than what we think for, that will be covered by the amount of food that patient is taking, we give some extra dose before the meal, and that is known as correctional insulin. We have seen how the normal physiological insulin secretion happens. There is a basal insulin secretion for the hepatic glucose to tackle the hepatic glucose output, and there is a bolus insulin which we give when a patient is diabetic before food, and there is a correctional in patients admitted in hospital. I'll just take you through. This is a difficult topic when I discuss, but when we do in routine practice and we start doing it, it is easy. So if you don't find it find to follow me because I talk faster, don't get upset, because this is something we are all doing. I've just put it into slides, so this may be a bit confusing sometimes, but I'll try to make it simpler. This is a patient weighing 80 kilogram, BMI 28 kilogram per meter square, normal renal function. He has come to us with the high sugars. Okay. So we need to know how much blood sugar for this blood sugar. His value is high, 400, and HbA1c is more than 6.5, and we need to start the patient on insulin. So we don't know how much we should be starting. Okay, so we need to know whether the patient has got risk of hypoglycemia. This is a very young person, 45 years, but he's obese, and this is why he is here with an infection. So it's an underweight. We start with lower dose of insulin, but usually we can start it around zero point 0.4 units per kilogram per body weight in a normal weight patient. And patient coming to us insulin naive, so we need to determine how much insulin. Yesterday somebody asking where how much insulin we should give when we get a patient admitted. So I thought we will do the because we don't want to go for a higher insulin, because definitely there is a risk of hypoglycemia. I'll put it as normal weight, though his BMI is slightly higher. So we can start with zero point 0.4 units per kilogram body weight. That is 80 into zero point 0.4. So we have to calculate the total dose. We need to calculate the basal dose, bolus dose, and correctional dose if needed. Okay, total dose, they have put zero point 0.5, but usually I prefer to go with a lower dose, but we'll go with a 0.5 because thinking that patient is obese, his BMI is high. So 0.5 units per kilogram into 80, it comes to about 40 units. So we have to calculate the basal insulin dose. That is, if the patient is 40 units, we will give half as basal insulin and half as bolus insulin. That means about this 40, we will give 20 units at the basal dose and 20 units as the bolus dose. So this 20 units we can divide into 10 units in the morning and 10 units in the evening as NPH. Okay. And the next 20 units is the bolus dose. Bolus dose we will be giving only if the patient taking normal food. Suppose the patient is not taking anything, we will hold the bolus dose. But if the patient is taking something, we have to give only 20 units as the bolus dose. But the patient is taking what is expected 50%, then I will be giving only 10 units as the bolus, and 10 units we will split up into 3 or something like that, what the patient takes. If the patient is not taking for breakfast, no bolus. If the patient is taking some food for lunch, you can give some bolus. So that way we can titrate the bolus insulin. So basal insulin, we can give NPH insulin or the insulin analog, basal analogs like glargine or degludec. Bolus insulin, we give, our hospital supply is regular insulin, but we can use the rapid acting analogs like aspart, lispro, glulisine, or ultra fast acting insulin also is available, that is faster insulin, aspart. But we will give a bolus dose only if the patient is eating. That is very, very important, because sometimes we have seen prescription, there is only bolus dose written in an ICU, in a hospitalized patient. So this is not correct. Okay. And supplemental dose. Suppose we saw that this patient is going to eat lunch and we wanted a pre-lunch blood glucose 150, but sister says the pre-lunch sugar is 250. That means it's more. So we can add a supplemental dose of 3 units or 2 units, and usually we cover 1 unit for 50 milligram because we are worried about hypoglycemia than hyperglycemia. Okay, so this is about the supplemental dose. That is the additional dose we give when the patient has got a very high sugar for that point. And also, I have already told which insulin we need to address. If the pre-lunch sugar is high, we will be adjusting the insulin we have given pre-breakfast. Pre-dinner in sugar is high, we will be adjusting the pre-lunch. So that way, that insulin that we'll be giving before will be adjusted, not the insulin that we give after. But when we give a correctional dose, it's only for that amount of higher blood glucose. It is not the regular dose. Then we will go back to the normal dose once we set the targets properly. And this is about the patient hospitalized and patient can eat, and we want a basal bolus regime. But if a patient is in ICU, we don't know what is going to happen. Patient is not eating anything. Then the safest insulin is always IV insulin. So I'll just tell you, this is preferred when there is an insulin requirement is rapidly changing. We cannot know what is absorbed, what is the subcutaneous, generalized edema. We don't know whether what is happening to the insulin we are giving. Patient is very disoriented. We cannot ensure proper feeding. there is impaired perfusion of subcutaneous sites, hypotension, the need for pressure support. In all those situations in ICU, we prefer ICU, IV insulin. How do we give IV insulin? Also, I just mentioned, even if there are some confusion, because it is because of the way I present it, it is very easy. And we can discuss it because your experience also might be different from what I discussed today. So there are many issues in ICU, all the ICU settings, and if the patient is on prolonged labor, we are not ensuring any feed or procedure surgery, we can advise the patient on IV insulin. And IV insulin, it is always better to start with insulin infusion pump. And the easiest way is we put 50 units of regular insulin in 50 ml normal saline, and that dose will be 1 unit per ml. Okay. And how much insulin we start? We can start from a lower dose, like 4 units per hour. Or if you think there is a high risk of hypoglycemia, we can start with 2 units per hour or 1 unit per hour. There are some calculations also. We don't have to worry much about the calculation, but if you are very particular about knowing one number, suppose the patient has got 260 minus 60 into 0.02. This is the multiplier. This will give you how much will be the rate of insulin infusion. Or you can just start with a lower dose like 3 units or 4 units, and we do it hourly, and we can increase the dose depending upon the need of the patient. And we will preparing the infusion for 1 unit per ml. But if you don't want to give that much volume for some reason, we can put it the 50 units in 25 ml, then 0.5 ml will be containing 1 unit. But we should be very careful how much we are putting in and how much is the dilution. Okay. And we can give the infusion rate. We frequently check hourly, and we need to maintain it about 140 to 180 milligram or slightly higher in a patient in ICU. That means around 200 milligram per deciliter. And the orders must be very clearly written, and the monitoring chart must be fixed to the case sheet. And in the ICU, when we give insulin infusion, our worry is not control, but our worry is always hypoglycemia. That is why the monitoring is very, very important. And we can titrate the dosage of insulin infusion. These are all rough estimate, and we have guidelines for each institution. We have guidelines for each place. Many guidelines are available, but we can modify and we can use what is best suitable for you. And always train the staff about correction of hypoglycemia, blood glucose monitoring. Give 25 gram dextrose, 50 ml, 50% we give for the patient, and then we check blood glucose after 15 minutes. This is also very important. Once hypoglycemia, repeat blood glucose after 15 minutes. Okay. And once we have put the patient on insulin infusion, patient is very much controlled, patient is coming back, patient is going to take oral feeds. At that point, we should switching back to subcutaneous insulin. Subcutaneous insulin means we should ask what is the 24-hour insulin requirement for this patient. So they will give us one value. So suppose the patient is nil orally and no bolus, the amount that we have given as IV insulin is actually the basal insulin requirement. So we will see the total dose and see whether the patient was taking anything orally, and then calculate what is the basal insulin the patient was receiving. None taken orally. So what we have given is actually the basal insulin. So we can calculate from the 24 hours previous when the blood glucose is controlled, and we should be continuing the IV insulin for 2 hours after giving the subcutaneous insulin. Okay. And similarly, how we are converted, we have to convert back to the basal and bolus insulin. See the basal insulin and give the basal insulin. Suppose 20 units was given for the last 24 hours. This 20 units will be the basal insulin, and the patient was not eating anything orally. So we will give this 20 units as NPH, Glargine or Degludec, and then we will start the other 20 units should be the bolus insulin, but we will be giving only if the patient starts eating, and it could be how much amount of food that patient is taking. So we will be gradually up titrating the bolus dose. This is the mealtime bolus dose. It depends upon how much the patient taking. Patient is taking very little. It could be only 10% of basal dose, or if it starts eating properly, it will be the equal as basal dose. So similarly, we need to titrate. So we have to calculate the basal dose from the last 24 hours, and the total dose will be basal plus bolus, that is 50 plus 50%, that is 20, then plus 20 will be the total dose, and we can calculate and we can put the patient. So if the patient is nil per orally, whatever we have given for the last 24 hours will be the basal insulin. Okay. So this is something I think I don't have to put it because it's we will discuss if it is required. Okay. And in all those patients hospitalized with hyperglycemia, we need to have a discharge plan. It is necessary to assess the patient's daily schedule, meal plan, insulin self-administration ability, and financial resources, and listen to the experienced patient. The patient might tell, I need this insulin. This insulin works for me. Earlier, I used to get angry. Why this patient is speaking like this? But now I know that patient knows about him more than I know about his diabetes. And we have talked of many things, but we cannot forget about the comorbidities like obesity, hypertension, dyslipidemia, all those things. It will come together. So we cannot treat diabetes alone. We cannot treat hypertension alone. We need to see for all those things. We need to tell them that smoking to be stopped. And this just clearly says how much the burden that happens to the patient. If I didn't have to pay for my diabetes medicine, I would have been a millionaire by now. So we need to understand this from patient side. And smoking cessation, any type of smoking, passive smoking, is very, very important that we should tell them to stop smoking. It is very important. And we have discussed about some of the special situations, but the special situations other than what we have discussed, I was implying about pregnancy, gestation diabetes or pre-gestation diabetes, and the targets for diagnosis, and the cutoffs are also different, and we do more stringent closer follow-up in pregnancy. And children, we have to be very different in approach to children because we need to tell them more time to educate the children as well as their parents, and the parents will be so much worried if the child gets diagnosed with diabetes. Elderly, they have very little capabilities to understand, but we should not underestimate an elderly, and some of them are very much capable of handling their issues, so this is also very important. And the other situation is limited life expectancy. So I have been taking so much of time, and we put our effort to train at every point, and such WhatsApp messages make us also laugh. This is how patients understand about our dietary interventions and education. And this is how the pharmacist also over the counter sometimes the advice they get. So we have to be very careful with our patients. And again, I tell one size doesn't fit all. Living with diabetes is a challenge. It needs hard work to accommodate it as a constant companion 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we need to individualize treatment and psychosocial care and support. This is a very major issue. This has to be addressed in a patient with diabetes. And I've been talking for some time now. And sometimes patient, we feel that this patient is coming to us again and again. He's not understanding whatever I am saying. His blood glucose is still uncontrolled. Nothing is going to work in this patient. This patient is following my advice. But most of the time, we must also have a look at within ourselves. Check the people, check that people understand what we are saying to them. Clarify the benefits of treatment. They are doubtful about our medications. Even if they don't take, they don't have any symptoms. Keep regime simple. Don't put Vaser bolus 5 injections for an elderly person. Patient will never take. Minimize costs. Some patients will change from one doctor to the other doctor to the other doctor just because they cannot afford it. And always discuss adverse effects. So this is very important.
Are micro and macrovascular complications completely reversible? That is one question.
Microvascular, actually the complications depend upon the duration of the diabetes and glycemic control. So once it develops, it's usually not reversible. We can arrest the progression by taking care of these things, but the patient come, even it depends even the duration of diabetes. Duration we cannot alter. What we can do is we can detect them early and we can control the glycemic part, but the other part is not it's not completely reversible. Okay, but we can arrest the progression of the thing and we can delay the development of microvascular complication by proper control.
Madam, based on Kerala protocol, Pyoglit is given. So what about the black box warning that is given?
Black box warning is there for every drug if you really look into it. Okay, every drug has got a black box warning. Okay, even the newer drugs has got black box warning. So we have to be careful. We will not be giving in patients with the heart failure. We will not be giving in patients with suspected what bladder cancer or patient on treatment of bladder cancer, patient on hematuria. And we are starting with a very low dose that is 7.5 milligram, and we are closely monitoring, and we are not going beyond 15 milligram. That is why. So we have to monitor for every drug, and there is black box warning for every drug.
Madam, next question is what about giving aspirin as prophylaxis in diabetes? Is that necessary?
Aspirin as prophylaxis actually not indicated in young diabetic, but age more than 45 with multiple comorbidities, or we really think this patient has got underlying cardiovascular disease. Otherwise, it's not indicated. So we have to individualize and we have to decide. But all patients with diabetes, hypertension, age more than 45, high risk of CAD, we have to start. But in youngsters, we don't start aspirin at all. And even otherwise, aspirin is now there. I think there is a tendency to decrease the use of aspirin and to definitely use if indicated.
Madam, next question is I have seen a person who had abscess developing at every site of his insulin injection. Advised him on frequent changing of site, local care of injection site before injection. Still, he developed abscess. What can be done?
This is also a problem. We had also similarly one patient. Every time patient gets injection abscess, and we need to do incision and drainage, and it takes a lot of time, and patient will not have any site for injection. In such situations, we with proper care we can advise all those things, and still patient is developing abscess. We can advise them to change on a smaller needle or pens if possible. So that makes the insulin injection very painless, and needle is also more finer. So that is one way we can advise them. I don't know. Luckily, with that patient, when I advised to change to a device, it disappeared. But most of the time, they prick and they use the same needle. The proper things may not be happening. So, if the patient cannot afford all those things, we'll have to revise and see what is happening for the patient. But patient needing frequent hospitalization and treatment and cost, they will be willing to buy a pen film to try this method also. And rotation of the injection site, you have already told.
A patient with good diabetic control develops callus and Fisher foot. Can we advise keratolytic agents for that patient?
Yeah, keratolytic agents are not usually advised, but we can do the callus removal. But by either we can do ourselves. Okay, we can we can train our healthcare worker to do the callus removal, but sterile blades. Or devices also available, but most of our facilities will have sterile scalpel blades. We can use it, but keratolytics are actually not advised in diabetic foot because there is a risk of injury of the other skin area and things like.
A patient with high blood sugars, even after maximum doses of metformin, glimepiride, and pioglitazone, and who's not ready to take insulin, which is the next best OHA to be given?
We can do that the fourth drug if the patient is actually not willing, but we can give them what we can tell them is you have to take insulin, and this is the time, the correct time for taking insulin, and blood glucose control is what is actually needed to prevent complications, especially for complications like retinopathy and nephropathy. They are very much afraid of. We will tell them that way you have to have an education session, but meanwhile we can start a DPP4 inhibitor like gliptin, like teneligliptin, linagliptin, or vildagliptin, or sitagliptin. We can advise them, and we must tell them we are giving them an opportunity to try, but we are also not sure whether it will be useful, because it depends. It's not your failure, it is depending upon how much insulin your pancreas is giving. So if pancreas cannot do, your diabetes will not be controlled. So we have to have a proper education session And if the patient has got no life-threatening hyperglycemic symptoms, we can go with an fourth drug like gliptin will be a good option because if there is no hypoglycemia. But in patients with CKD or cardiac failure like this, SGLT2 inhibitors are also another option. So we can give any of these drugs. But usually, once we give a proper education session and give them an opportunity, and it's not your failure, it's a disease is the problem. Next visit, they will be willing to take up the insulin, but they are not willing because sometimes elderly are not willing because they don't have the facility at home to train them and to see their eyes may be not properly formed. So we can give a simpler regime like a longer acting insulin like analog like Glargine. If they can take one insulin may be useful for some time. So that way we can gradually introduce them to insulin. Okay, even syringe and needle patients are so much afraid, but they may be willing to take one insulin. Then we can start with a basal insulin, then slowly introduce them to twice daily. It is a time-taking procedure, but we can gradually put them into insulin.
Madam, in a peripheral primary setting, can we take PPBS hyperglycemia cutoff as 140 or follow 180 as per guideline shown in NCD Department of Health and Family Welfare?
We can guide 140. I have put it. Suppose we have a patient coming in hospital, patient comes with some symptoms and his one value is more than 140. We always put them. It's beyond. It's not normal for PPBS as per the cutoffs we understand. So we always tell them to come up with a fasting and post meal if the patient has got milder symptoms. If there is no immediate urgency. But if the patient is hospitalized, we will obviously ask for a fasting on post meal on the next day and an HbA1c if available. But the control post meal we can put it as 180. Okay, we don't have to go tighter control, but a very young patient, no risk of hypoglycemia, we can go for a more stringent control where the HbA1c will be less than 6.5. But the control we are aiming at an HbA1c less than 7, but more importantly, we are aiming at no hypoglycemia. Patient can do all the activities and those things. But better control is always advisable, but without risking hypos for the patient.
Patient with uncontrolled sugar levels started on insulin monotherapy still not getting under control. When to start oral medicines along with insulin?
In type 2 diabetes, we start with metformin. And if there is high sugars or if the patient comes with hyperglycemic symptoms, we can start them on insulin. And if the blood glucose is a control, we can go back to OHA. But your question is patient on insulin, when can we add OHA along with insulin?
Exactly.
Okay, that happens.
It is not under control. Then when at what point of
usually insulin has no lower limit. That's what they say. No lower limit cutoff for blood glucose in insulin, but we will have to give higher doses of insulin. But sometimes if we would like to reduce the insulin dose, we can add a glimepiride in the morning and try that way. But usually it's unlikely that we are not able to control blood glucose with insulin. Insulin, if you increase the dose, definitely they will develop control. But if you would like, we don't want to give a high dose of insulin, either patient cannot afford or patient cannot inject all sorts of things. We can add other OHAs like any gliptin. But if there is an advanced diabetes, what works is usually insulin.
A patient who is diabetic for 20 years developed altered protein creatinine ratio 181, reverted back to 0.25 with DAPA. What drug to be continued?
DAPA we can continue. We can continue dapagliflozin, but what is the dose that we have to take? But DAPA is not actually the drug that we give for diabetic nephropathy. We are still on ACI inhibitors or ARBs for diabetic nephropathy. But in patients with heart failure and other, dapagliflozin can be given at a lower dose. Studies are available. But DAPA is not the drug for nephropathy. We should be giving ACI inhibitors or ARB, which are the time-tested drugs for nephropathy.